Hi, and welcome to Women in Philanthropy. This is a podcast about and by women working in philanthropic giving. Grantmakers, fundraisers, executive directors, researchers, advisors. You can't always see behind the scenes in philanthropic giving, and that means you can't see who enables this giving. My name is Michelle Fugel-Gartner. I'm a philanthropic practitioner and researcher. My doctoral research demonstrated that most of what we know about working in philanthropic giving is told to us through a male point of view. This podcast offers the opportunity to hear from women working in giving. The idea for a podcast was inspired by having dim sum with my friends and talking about our roles in philanthropy, our challenges, and our thoughts. Each 15-minute episode will connect you with a woman in philanthropy. You'll hear about her role, how she got there, and how it enables giving. You'll also hear her thoughts on issues such as worth, negotiation, and influence. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you are a woman working in philanthropy and would like to share your story, please get in touch. And now, our Woman in Philanthropy. The Women in Philanthropy podcast is generously sponsored by the Voluntary Sector Studies Network. VSSN promotes understanding of the UK voluntary sector through research and provides a voice and a meeting place for voluntary sector researchers in the UK. Membership is invited from academics and practitioners. For more information, look at the website www.vssn.org.uk. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to episode 5 of Women in Philanthropy. I'm very excited today. We're here with Anna Bruni Sabhaney. And Anna was the first person I interviewed, but we didn't do a mic check or sound check, and the entire audio did not work. So it's very exciting to have Anna back with us today. Anna, we've had this whole conversation before, but nobody got to hear it. So
it'll be a better one this time around, hopefully.
Absolutely. So why don't we dive into it? What is your role in philanthropy?
So I, as many women do, have many hats, including being a mother and being a chartered civil engineer. But I really fell into philanthropy and the nonprofit sector about 5 years ago. I had a role as a trustee of a charity. And as part of that role, I was looking at how can sort of engineering skills that I developed over time, so everything from people management to relationship management to fundraising to actually executing programs and designing programs, how could these skills be relevant beyond the scope of the private sector clients I had at the time? And I found a number of things about the nonprofit sector that really excited me. And when I actually went and looked for a role in the nonprofit sector, I couldn't find one. And so I ended up creating basically a role for myself. What I do through the Confluencers is I basically work on helping fundraisers and nonprofit funders and nonprofit CEOs and founders to basically see eye to eye on what type of work they're doing. So the focus of my role is really getting people aligned on their interests so they can do more work together more effectively, more efficiently, and with more joy and with healthier power dynamics.
And within that role, what have you found some of the most common challenges?
Oh, there's been a lot. So I'll break them into two, I suppose. I'll break them into the challenges that I see maybe from the bigger sector and the challenges that I've seen specifically with nonprofit founders facing. I think from the bigger sector, there's some dynamics. It's funny how we even define the sector as the nonprofit sector, right? It's defined by what it's not. There is this still discomfort around money in the nonprofit sector and its role. And I think that transpires and sort of trickles down into unhealthy power dynamics when it comes to talking about money. So who decides where the money gets spent, which leads to systemic issues that we're seeing, like money not always going to smaller organizations, to smaller cities, to smaller grassroots organizations, and sort of ending up with the safer bet, so to speak, or the bigger organizations. And it also filters down, then moving into sort of the individual from a nonprofit founder perspective. I think it affects many things. It affects the job satisfaction nonprofit leaders get.
Right.
It affects confidence. It affects the type of staff you're able to attract because of salaries. So I think it's a really big issue from all sides. And the fundamental challenge is if we don't agree if we don't respect each other's knowledge and each other's roles in the space, and if we don't spend enough time and effort and energy actually pulling apart what it is that we want to do, then you end up with these unhealthy power dynamics, money being misspent, which then filters down to unhappy.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you brought it up. It's a huge, like you said, and at different levels, it affects it in different ways. In the work that you've done, sort of sitting between these stakeholders, do you have an example of how you were able to sort of change minds or bring people together to understand that it could look in a different way? Could you share a little bit of that with us?
Absolutely. So that's actually a lot of what we try to cover in a course I developed, which is called Roadmap to Self-Reliance. I think it starts at the beginning of a conversation or the beginning of a relationship. Typically, the beginning starts with a funder setting out an RFP, and immediately in that second, that defines the relationship in a certain way because it says, I, the funder, am the client. I want this list of things, which is my RFP or my call for proposals. Who can meet my list of things, right? Um, who's going to buy? Who's going to give me what I want? And already that from that beginning, there's sort of the seed of this unhealthy dynamic. And so I think some of the examples that I've come across is how do you deal with different requests from funders? I was working for a nonprofit. They were an international nonprofit. They'd asked me to help them write a grant. We rolled our sleeves up. We got our act together. We put a submission in. And very happily, we got a really great response back. They were like, "This is great. This is brilliant. We're really excited about it." And I bumped into one of these funder managers, and they reiterate, "Oh, we love the proposal. It's so great, but," and there was a long list of buts, and it was like, "But our department hasn't screened it, and the language isn't right, and this needs this tick, and this needs this approval, and we need to change this, and we need to change this, and we also need to change all of this before I, individual, go on secondment." And I was just, wait a second, right? I was like, wait a second. Are you saying that, like, if you're saying that there's things that we need to change in the
Right.
proposal that are actually going to benefit the end user, the people that we're trying to help, the beneficiary, the end user,
Right.
that are going to improve the quality of the outcomes for them, great, bring it on, let's do it. But if you're saying that I should advise my client to pay for my time to jump through your bureaucratical hoops,
Mm,
I'm sorry, I can't do that. Like, I don't approve of that. That's not what I believe in. I don't think it's necessary, and it's not a good use of our times.
right.
Um, and they came back and they said, "Oh, well, the project just won't happen then." And I obviously pushed back. I said, "Oh, yes, it will. You're not the only funder we're approaching." And so I think that was like one example of the different viewpoints and of how, like, from her perspective, uh, she was obviously given a different task, right? Her task
Right.
is to enable grant makers enable grant makers to progress their work, to screen, like, she's allocated a budget for it, right?
Right.
But what she doesn't realize is that for a nonprofit, like, every single hour that's spent on funding or fundraising is time away from operating.
Exactly.
And so the
Exactly.
requests are not always framed, I think, with a deep understanding of the impact they have on the other organization.
And it's other people on the podcast have talked about the real need to have somebody in a translator role, somebody who can speak in both directions. And I think that sounds, quite a bit like what your role has entailed. I'm fascinated, and I think our listeners will be fascinated that you were an engineer.
And so,
So
yeah, proud one.
and still are. So I'm curious. Two questions here, I suppose, is that how did that lead you into this role? But also, what has that given you as part of how you approach the work you do?
The way I see it, it's actually sort of engineering is very, very similar to a lot of social impact implementation programs. Like,
Okay.
because if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, that a lot of charities tie themselves into, what do they cover? They cover water,
Hmm.
they cover employment, they cover infrastructure, they cover the economy, they cover energy, they cover the environment. Civil engineering, by definition, is basically um, the design, the management, the creation, the implementation, the execution, the operation of systems that serve people
Yeah.
in the widest sense. So civil engineers design cities, they design buildings, they design water infrastructure, they design flood risk protection, they design they create sustainable environments. So environmental engineering is a branch of civil engineering, water engineering is a branch. So to me as an engineer, it was always my remit to do something for the social good. I suppose the difference is a lot of engineering, it's in the model of operation. So a
Right.
lot of engineering firms and clients operate and maybe serve private developers, so private clients, or governments maybe, and a few of them maybe work in the development space, but not as many. I see a big overlap, right? You've got charities that work in water, charities that work in energy, charity that work in inclusive employment. So to me, the two are actually very similar. It's just a different model.
Then what specifically does it add to your approach?
I think the biggest challenge I faced when shifting sector was mentally starting from zero again and humbling
Right.
myself and sort of taking off the entitled hat, because I'd reached a stage in my engineering career where I was quite comfortable
Okay.
in my engineering journey.
Right.
But by switching careers, I couldn't just go in and assume that everybody knew how engineering was relevant. I had to
Okay.
sort of say, okay, I'm going to start from scratch. I'm going to learn from the sector, and then I'm going to figure out how my skills map onto it. So I
Right.
think humbling myself was a key step. Um, and then I invested a lot in my own personal learning. So I took a lot of courses, and then I think a lot of self reflection.
Yep.
So a lot of actual general conversations with myself to figure out, okay, what do I like doing?
Right.
What can I bring? What am I good at?
And did you find
And
those did those skills transfer pretty easily once you had identified them?
I think they did, but it took about like 6,000 hours of interviews and 200 plus people to actually have the confidence to go with it and actually do it.
Right. Right.
Because I think at the beginning it was like, this makes sense to me, but I don't want to be the aggressive out. I felt like an outsider, I think, moving into the
Okay.
sector. I felt
Okay.
like, oh, I'm new to the sector.
Right.
I can't just bulldoze in and think I know better.
Well,
Maybe
that's
these
a
things already
fascinating
exist,
perspective.
right?
I think maybe, if I am provocative here, some people don't take that approach, that they do feel like maybe they can influence the sector quite easily, that there's not, I guess my example is we also often talk about the business mindset, that you can bring business skills very simply into the nonprofit sector, or maybe not simply, but easily. So that's fascinating that you felt, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but intimidated, or you felt like you had to do the learning.
Yeah, I mean, intimidated for sure because everything was new and I was confused about what I wanted to do, and I still loved engineering, but I was doing something new. But I think it stemmed actually from one of the workshops I led. Uh, in these workshops, I'd invited people from the nonprofit sector, the development space, universities, and engineers. And one person in particular, in that workshop really stuck with me. And he said, if this was easy, they would have already done it. Because there were a lot of young, bright engineers, including myself, saying, "Oh, we could do this, we could do this, we could solve this." And he was like, "Wait a second. You can't just like come with a Western or a I know it all mentality, rain into somebody's office and say, 'Oh, I think I know better. This is how we do it.' You got to
Right.
learn first. You got to figure out where the challenges are, and then." So I think I was following their advice. So I think I executed on what they recommended, and I'm really glad I did.
So say more about that. I'm really curious about, in your words, how you would talk about how this role then enables giving. I mean, you talked quite a bit about how it bridges between stakeholders. And so what's your ultimate hope in terms of how it enables giving then?
I mean, my hope, if I have to put like a blue sky thinking hat on
Yes.
for a second, uh, my hope would be that all philanthropists are able to give from a place of true um, selflessness. They are able to trust. They're able to give out of the pure
Mm.
joy of giving without over rationalizing it and without
Oh, that's
over
aspirational. I like that too.
systematizing it and just
Yeah.
being like, you know what, I have this money. It's excess money. I don't need it. I'm going to do something good with it. And I'm going to do that with joy. And I'm going to
Right.
do that with generosity and but the spirit of generosity of here, take it. It's yours,
Right.
right? Not the here, take it, but I need
And
to
many,
control
many
this and I need to
documents and
control
bureaucracy
this
later.
and I'll
Yeah.
take it back if it's not exactly what I want. Like I suppose it's the art of delegation. It's the art of letting go.
Hmm.
Um, and I feel like the sector in some sense has put so much focus on monitoring evaluation and quantification and analysis that it must be very hard. I mean, I've worked mostly with nonprofit founders, So the
Right.
receiving side of the puzzle. But I imagine it's must be hard for philanthropists also to start off on a journey of like, I want to do something good with this money, and then be told, oh, but you can't. You've got to follow all these rules. You've got to study. It
Yeah.
must create insecurity from their side as well.
Yeah. I would say it sets the bar pretty high.
It sets the
Because if
bar
you,
high, and I
yeah,
don't know what it adds, right? Like, what does it? I'm as an engineer, I bring a lot of rigor and or logic to um, a lot of what we cover in the course is about like how do you justify your impact. So I'm not saying you don't need that,
right.
but I don't know. I think it's featuring too much. So my aspiration would be philanthropists are able to give freely without guilt and to
Right.
trust and to practice the art of trusting others and just giving. And on the same side, nonprofits are able uh, to receive without guilt and to sort of also ask for what they need and
Right.
be confident enough to actually ask, show their imperfections, show their mistakes, ask for risk funding,
That's
risk
right.
budgets to make mistakes to learn. Because I think that's where philanthropy provides potential, say, in comparison to some of the other sectors.
That's right. I think that's the real benefit of it. It can be a real risk-taking gift, really. But again, like you said, with a dose of trust and a dose of, we're going to be in this together. We'll see what happens without over bureaucratizing it. Okay, so this actually segues very nicely into asking your point of view on what issue in philanthropy you think needs airing. I mean, you've brought up several, I think, bubbling beneath the surface, but if there's one that you wanted to highlight, which would it be?
I think it's this power dynamic. I think it's this. I just want to make the case that it's not serving us,
Go for it.
right? So
Why isn't it serving us?
so if you look at it, the power dynamics presumes things that are incorrect to start with, right? It presumes that funders have all the answers. They don't. And by funders, I mean philanthropists,
Mhm.
impact investors, high net worth individuals, trusts, foundations, whoever's giving money. Um, it assumes that you specify something and that something is fixed, and you know that from the beginning, and that remains constant throughout time. So it assumes no change, which again is nonsense. If anybody who's implemented any program knows that things change, and as somebody I interviewed in India, who I can't remember the name of unfortunately at the moment, phrased it very wisely. He said, if if your brief doesn't change from the beginning to the end of a program, you should really start to challenge what value you're adding and how
Mm,
you're going about it, because what you're saying is your knowledge will not change. You will not learn anything new
right.
that will lead you to challenge your brief. And then what else is not working? Well, the terms and the contracts don't work. So from that, the RFP then becomes a funding agreement. And typically these funding agreements have terms that again are based on these incorrect assumptions of no change, I know it
Right.
all, which therefore, what do? They hand over all the risk to the receiving organization. And they say, and they're unreasonable, right? They say things like, you will indemnify me for everything. I will own all your IP. Um,
Right.
if you don't reach your
Yep.
milestones, if you don't achieve these set in stone outcomes, I'm not going to pay you. Now,
Right.
that's not collaboration, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's
That
right.
doesn't work.
And I
And
don't think a lot of people get to see these terms. I don't think that's something that, I mean, obviously in the work that you've done, and if you're a funder, and obviously if you're a grant writer on the recipient end, but I don't think the wider public knows what type of contractual relationship it is.
I totally agree. I mean, this is definitely something that comes from my engineering background, because the engineering sector, there's an analogy. There's a lot of conflict historically in the engineering sector. A lot of money is spent, right?
Right. Yeah.
Millions, billions the government spends on building things. And obviously things go late all the time. You dig up
Yes, they
something, you
do.
find,
They really
right?
do.
I mean, you dig up something, you find the wrong pipe, you misplace a piece of dangerous material, your tractor gets stuck. Like, well, anything can happen, right? And so the engineering sector has actually interestingly recognized the adversarial nature of these relationships and has proactively worked on it. So they've
Oh,
developed
fascinating.
a standard set of agreements that aim to do exactly what we're talking about. They aim to make sure that everybody in the team reads the agreement because it's not in legal speak,
Right.
and actually that the agreement serves a purpose. It's not just like take it out on a rainy day when, forgive me, the shit hits the fan,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
No, it's actually something that you use as a project management tool. It helps you deal with change. It helps you deal with risk. It helps you get better work done. And so a lot of what I'm hope and I aspire for the nonprofit sector is that they reach similar agreements and they draw from some of these examples.
It's a great example of how you can actually transfer skills and processes in um, to have a real benefit. as opposed to sort of an ideological, we need to be more businesslike. There's a real example of how this could actually work. I'm conscious of time because as a mom, you have a hard stop in about 15 minutes, even less than that. So before you go, I want to ask you 3 rapid fire questions, if you're okay with that.
Absolutely.
What is the worst philanthropic jargon?
I think for me, it's admin costs and project costs, because ultimately all costs should be costs that enable you to achieve your mission and your goals, and therefore they should all be impact cost, or whatever you want to call them, costs, necessary costs to achieving your goals. So I think splitting them into these words that have these connotations of this one's necessary, this one's less necessary, is just not helpful.
All right. On the other side of the coin, what's the most inspiring trend you're seeing, or practice, or person? What keeps you optimistic?
I think it's this push towards trust-based philanthropy and flexible funding. It's also just the practicalities of it.
Yeah.
Like what does that actually look like in practice? Because I'm always wary of supporting new fancy terms, like shiny terms, because in many cases, some of these practices have been existing for decades.
Yes, exactly.
They're just not called trust-based.
Something.
They're not
exactly.
Which is fine. But if it takes calling them something to make them more celebrated and unify, great. But let's go deeper than just the language, and let's figure out, okay, how can we translate this into practical ways of being, of managing, of communicating that actually get us to our goals. Again, I suppose engineer, project manager hat on. No, let's make sure this happens in practice. Let's not just talk about it.
It's great. I think that's exactly it, right? Raising awareness in order to get people to implement it, I think is wonderful. All right. Well, the last question I have for you, what do you think the next needed role in philanthropy is then?
I think it's complex systems communicators.
What are those?
we might need another session to talk about those in more depth. But one of my passions, and one of the things I suppose crosses over engineering and my work with the Confluencers, is complexity, and the fact that behind this misunderstanding of what work should we be doing, what should we prioritize, how do we get to our goals, is the reality that a lot of these social issues that we tackle, whether they be cities engineering programs or sustainable development goals, climate change, they're complex, right? And at the moment, our tools of communicating, our systems, our frameworks for monitoring things, they still use a very outdated mentality, which is we break things up into little pieces. We solve the pieces and we put it back together. And with complex systems, that just doesn't work, because that mentality ignores the relationships between the pieces.
Right.
And so we really need a new way of communicating and talking about our work that enables us to take into account these key relationships between pieces and use those to our advantage. So that, for example, if we've got a water program that is also supporting agriculture, that is also supporting livelihoods, we can actually see the interrelations of those themes, and we're comfortable talking about them, we're comfortable fundraising across them, we're comfortable shifting budgets between them. It becomes more fluid. It doesn't become these siloed disciplines. And I think that will help in building momentum, and building advocacy, and building clarity on what needs to be done, attracting funding for it, and therefore getting there faster.
I love it. I love the idea. Over the weekend, I was reading a book on quantum gravity. Quantum physics.
I will read that.
But the thing is, it's all about talking about how it exists in the processes in between, the relationships between things. I was like, oh, quantum philanthropy. So there's something in what you're saying with the complexity and dealing with complexity that, who knows, maybe physics has something to say to us on that. I really want to thank you for your time today. Yes, Anna will share her top resources with us. They'll be linked in the pod sheet. And thank you, everybody, for being with us today. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. As well, check out all the links and the resources in the show notes. If you are a woman in philanthropy and would like to share your story, please get in touch. That's all for this episode. See you next time.